The paper was thin, cheap pulp, edges bruised by too many fingers. It carried a seal that looked almost beautiful in the lamplight, a hard red circle pressed into gray ink. In the doorway, the messenger didn't step inside. He kept his sandals on the threshold, like the house itself might accuse him. No one in the room said Cold War. No one said internationalization, or dominoes, or associated states. The words on the page were smaller than that. Date, place, a list of items to bring if you had them, a warning not to be late. Outside, the village was still asleep, except for the noises that never slept anymore. A cough in the dark, a mortar's hollow thud far away, the soft squeal of a cartwheel that needed oil. Somewhere down the road, a rooster tried and failed to sound normal. The man holding the paper, call him Min, or don't call him anything at all, turned it once as if the back might explain the front. His mother watched his hands, not his face. She stared at the seal, because seals were what made things real now. And this is the first trick of 1949. A war can change shape without changing place. In Hanoi, in Saigon, in Paris, people were learning a new vocabulary for an old violence. The French had a problem that rifles couldn't solve. The world after 1945 was suddenly allergic to empires. Words like liberation and self-determination were no longer propaganda. Sometimes they were policy. So, the war needed a costume. They found it in a man with a crown already taken from him. In 1949, the French backed the creation of a new political shell, something that looked like independence if you glanced quickly. A state of Vietnam under former Emperor Bao Jai, wrapped into a wider French-led structure across Indochina. Paper sovereignty, a flag, a capital, a face for photographs. But if you read the fine print, defense, finances, foreign policy, Paris still held the keys. The locks hadn't changed, only the label on the door. Why bother with the label? Because labels decide who shows up with money. On the other side of the world, another label had just shattered. China, vast, unavoidable, and suddenly lost in the language of Washington, had tipped into Mao's hands. In American newspapers and committee rooms, the question wasn't what had happened. It was who had allowed it. There were hearings, accusations, careers built on pointing at shadows. The Red Scare didn't need proof. It needed momentum. If communism could win in China, then it could win anywhere. That was the fear, not a careful analysis. Fear. Fear with an office. Fear with a budget. And Indochina sat in the middle of a region that already felt like dry grass. Rebellions in Malaya, unrest in the Philippines, agitation in Burma and Indonesia. Names blurred together in distant capitals, turning into one anxious sentence. It's spreading. So, Paris held up Bao Jai like a mirror and said, "Look, this is not colonialism. This is a sovereign partner fighting communist insurgency. Help us defend freedom." The United States at first didn't fully buy it. Washington had its own anti-colonial instincts, and France's empire smelled too strongly of yesterday. But 1949 kept stacking weight onto the scale. NATO formed. France was needed as a European bulwark. The Soviet Union tested an atomic bomb. The American monopoly snapped like a twig. And China's revolution sealed the sense that history was moving in only one direction: red. A veneer, a bomb, an alliance, and a fear. That's how a faraway jungle became a line in a global ledger. Back in the village, Min folded the paper with care, like it might tear if he hated it too openly. He didn't know about NATO. He didn't know which men in suits were trading sentences about his country. He only knew that the seal meant he would walk away from the rice fields and into the hills, where men stopped being sons and became numbers. The war on the ground was still uneven, still half hidden. French control clung to cities, to the arteries of roads, to the river routes that could be watched and shelled. The countryside, especially in the north, belonged to a different rhythm. Night movement, whispered warnings, sudden ambushes that erased convoys and then vanished into bamboo. The French had around 100,000 troops scattered across a long, jagged territory. Scattered is the important word. They held posts, forts, towns, little islands of sandbags and radio masts. Those garrisons ate manpower. The more places you controlled, the less force you had left to actually move. And movement was the thing the French were supposed to be good at. mobility, firepower, the confident choreography of a modern army. In northern Vietnam, the landscape refused choreography. Roads were narrow, broken, or simply not there. Heavy guns could not always follow. Vehicles became targets the moment they left the asphalt. Sometimes even the asphalt was a rumor. There was another limitation, quieter but sharper. France would not send its conscripted sons to die in a war the public didn't want. That meant volunteers, colonial troops, local auxiliaries, men whose loyalties were complicated at best, brittle at worst. It was hard to pacify a country when you could not afford to stay. On the other side, the Viet Minh had something France could not manufacture: patience fused to purpose. At the start of 1949, the People's Army of Vietnam was still under-equipped, still scraping weapons from battlefields and raids, still relying on crude local workshops to produce grenades and mines. But it had been building something else in the shadows: the skeleton of a conventional army, signals teams, intelligence networks, logistics that looked like poverty and functioned like steel. And then came the paper Minh held: mandatory service, a national pull of bodies into uniform, a village's young men transformed into battalions, numbers rising fast enough to change strategy itself. The war was learning to stand up. The other thing it learned to do, slowly at first, was to look north. Because when Mao's victory sealed the border in a new color, it wasn't just ideology next door. It was geography changing allegiance. Leaders in the Democratic Republic of Vietnam had long threads tied into China, years spent there, contacts made in exile, comrades met in training camps and smoky rooms where maps were unfolded and refolded until the creases became permanent. Now, those threads could become a rope. The idea was simple and dangerous. If the revolution in Vietnam could link itself to the socialist world, then the war would stop being a French problem and become a global contest. Recognition, aid, advisors, rifles that were not captured, radios that worked, artillery that could answer artillery. But every gift has a price, even when it arrives in the language of solidarity. Minh didn't know that either. What he knew was the weight of rice, because the army ate, the army marched, the army demanded a supply chain in a country where trucks were scarce and fuel scarcer. So the supply chain became human: porters, couriers, cooks, laundrymen and women, an entire moving village behind the fighting village. You could hear it at night on certain trails, not a roar, not an engine, but the soft percussion of feet and poles and breath, the clink of a pot, the creak of rope, someone whispering a joke that didn't quite land, a cough swallowed into a sleeve, then silence again. This is where the story stops being about flags and starts being about backs. A war can be internationalized in conference rooms, but it is carried across mountains one shoulder at a time. And that is the question that 1949 leaves hanging in the dark. If a conflict can be rebranded by a new state on paper, if the world can be persuaded by a sovereign face and a diplomatic phrase, then what happens to the people whose lives are not paper? What happens to Minh when the war is no longer just France versus Vietnam, but the free world versus the socialist camp? Because once the war becomes a symbol, it stops being allowed to end. In the north, there was a road the French had built close to the Chinese border, a long line of stone and dust and desperate resupply. It ran past isolated outposts, narrow valleys, ridges that watched everything. The French called it Route Colonial 4, RC4, like a bureaucratic code. But to the men who guarded it, it was a lifeline, with fingers always closing around the throat. To the Viet Minh, it looked like something else, a seam in the enemy's armor, a place where the war could be made to speak loudly enough for the world to hear. That year, the seam began to tighten. Small raids became rehearsals. Ambushes became measurements. Men like Minh learned to keep their mouths shut when the path turned uphill, to step where the foot in front had stepped, to ignore the burn in the shoulders, because stopping meant you became a problem the group couldn't afford. In distant capitals, the ink was still drying on new relationships. In the hills, ropes were being pulled taut around crates, and on RC4, the road bent toward a gorge that looked, in the late light, like a closing jaw. The war had not yet changed its name everywhere, but it had already changed its appetite. The first time the rifles arrived, they didn't look like destiny. They looked like freight, a crate dragged through mud, a lid pried up with a knife, Oil-stained paper peeled back to reveal metal that had been handled by strangers in another country under another sky. The men around the box didn't cheer. They counted. They checked bolts. They listened for the sound a magazine makes when it seats properly, an ordinary click that could decide whether you lived. Min was there, but not in the way the history books like. He wasn't the hand on the trigger. He was the shoulder under the strap. He had learned the new geography of the war, the places where you could rest without being seen, the paths that didn't exist on French maps, the streams that erased footprints. He could tell, from the way older porters tightened their ropes, whether tonight's load was rice or ammunition. Rice had its own hush. Ammunition made men swallow harder, and the night the crates came, the air itself felt different, like the hills had been waiting for this weight. Far away, a different kind of weight moved across desks. January 1950. A recognition letter. A seal. A formal sentence that turned a guerrilla state into a state with friends. Then another recognition, another capital, another set of signatures. Each one a small thunderclap that didn't echo in cities first, but in supply roads. Min didn't know the dates. He knew the effect. He saw it in the sudden orderliness of things that had once been improvised. A schedule, a chain of command, a training cadre that spoke with the calm authority of people who had already won one revolution and believed the next could be managed like a lesson. They came as advisors, but they moved like architects. A Chinese military advisory group, men who unfolded maps and pressed fingertips along roads the way a doctor presses a bruise. They asked questions that sounded simple until you tried to answer them. How many porters can your district provide for 10 days? How many days of rice can you hide within 2 kilometers of the objective? Where does your signal line break when it rains? War, they seem to say, is not only courage, it is accounting. Min watched a cadre, too young to look like an official, too tired to look like a dreamer, writing numbers on a slate, working days, carrying capacity, rotation schedules. The chalk squeaked, and the squeak felt like a prophecy. Here was the second trick of internationalization. Once the war was connected to a bloc, it gained tools, but it also gained expectations. You don't receive rifles without being expected to fire them. And once you start firing them the way a regular army does, you begin needing things a guerrilla war could pretend to live without. Artillery, radios, ammunition reserves, casualty replacement. A front line that holds, a rear area that feeds it. A population that can be organized until it stops feeling like a population and starts feeling like a machine. Min had thought the paper seal meant he would be taken from his life. He didn't yet understand it might also take his village's life. The old rhythms, the ability to say no, the illusion that you could stand aside while history argued overhead. In the French posts along the northern roads, the change was felt like a pressure drop. A legionnaire, call him Morel, stood watch above a bend in the road and listened to the jungle the way you listen to a room you don't trust. He had been told the Viet Minh were brave, but poorly equipped. He had been told their attacks were pinpricks, harassing, local. He had been told that French training would always outrun peasant improvisation. But lately the pinpricks were landing in patterns. Convoys hit not by chance, but by calculation. Outposts tested, not merely raided. Small probes that felt like someone measuring the strength of a door before putting a shoulder into it. Morel noticed the new sound first. Not the crack of rifles, those were familiar, but the deeper punctuation of heavier weapons somewhere out in the dark. Not often, not always close. Just enough to suggest the other side was learning a new grammar. He wrote a letter home that he never sent. In it, he did not admit fear, he admitted confusion. How can they be everywhere with so little? He didn't know the answer was, they weren't everywhere. They were concentrated now, because someone had decided to stop nibbling and start biting. On the Viet Minh side, the decision came with a quiet brutality. The border had to be opened, not for symbolism, for throughput. If the Democratic Republic was going to survive as more than a slogan, it needed a contiguous corridor to China, a place where supplies could move without being strangled by French outposts. A place where training could happen with less interruption. A place where the war could inhale. That place lay along a road the French had built to serve their own empire. Route Colonial 4, RC4, a line that ran close to the Chinese frontier, linking isolated garrisons like beads on a string. From the map, it looked neat. On the ground, it looked like a mistake. Too long, too narrow, too exposed. To hold it, France had to spread itself thin. To break it, the Viet Minh only had to choose the right bead. Minh heard the name RC4 spoken in a low voice around cooking fires. It was never said with romance. It was said like a task. Before the first major blow, there were rehearsals. In May, there was a strike on a position, hard, fast, enough to show what could be done, not enough to hold forever. French paratroops came in and took it back quickly, like a hand slapping down on a chess piece. The message was clear. France could still punch, but the reply was quieter and more dangerous. So can we. The summer that followed was a season of tightening. Ambushes on supply convoys, small forts abandoned by the French as they pulled men into fewer, stronger points. The road did not get safer, it got lonelier, and loneliness, on a road like that, is an invitation. Minh was assigned to a porter column supporting units moving toward the frontier. His load changed night to night. Sacks of rice, coils of wire, boxes marked only with chalk symbols, and once, a heavy cylinder that left his shoulder numb for hours. He wanted to ask what it was. He didn't. In a war that is growing up, curiosity becomes a liability. He met people who never appeared in speeches. Women washing uniforms in a stream until their hands cracked. Boys carrying messages folded so small they could be swallowed. Old men repairing sandals by firelight with the concentration of surgeons. Everyone moved as if the entire country had become a corridor. One night, a cadre sat beside Minh and spoke without looking at him. "We've been fighting a war that could go on forever," the cadre said. Forever is another word for defeat. Minh waited, breath tight in his throat. "The world is watching now," the cadre continued. "That means we must prove we are not only surviving, we must win." There it was, the third trick. International attention doesn't only bring help, it brings a deadline you can't see. September 1950. The Viet Minh attacked Jong Khe, an outpost held by a small, hard garrison. 2 days, 2 nights. The ridgelines turned into silhouettes against flashes that made the jungle look like a photograph taken by lightning. Orders ran down the line. Ammunition ran up the line. Men who had spent years moving like ghosts now moved like a wave. Minh was behind it, not at the walls, but in the stream of supplies that kept the assault from stalling. He felt the moment the battle tipped, not as a cheer, but as a change in traffic. Stretchers going the other way. Captured weapons carried back. The smell of cordite hanging low, mixing with wet earth. When the position fell, it was not merely a local victory. It was a statement to every desk in every capital. The war had crossed a threshold. For France, the response was panic, dressed as prudence. General Carpentier, far from the gorge, far from the mud, worried about something worse than defeat. The possibility of Chinese troops stepping directly across the border. Whether that fear was accurate or not mattered less than the fact that it guided decisions. He decided to withdraw from Sao Bang. On paper, it was a rational consolidation, pulling back from an exposed pocket, saving men for defensible lines. On the ground, it meant something else. A column on the move, burdened, vulnerable, trapped between ridges that belonged to someone else. Morel heard the order in a cramped bunker lit by a single bulb. Around him, men pretended not to look relieved. Withdrawal meant leaving behind the illusion that the road could be held. Withdrawal meant admitting the enemy had grown teeth. The column would move down RC4 toward that K. Another force would move up to meet it. They would link, then withdraw together. A clean plan, drawn on a clean map. But RC4 was not clean. Minh's porter units were told to move again. Faster, more quietly. There was urgency now. Not the slow urgency of survival, but the sharp urgency of opportunity. The cadres spoke in clipped sentences. The advisors pointed at specific bends and choke points and nodded as if they had seen this kind of road before. In the nights leading up to the withdrawal, Minh watched the hills fill with men who did not talk much. Artillery pieces were hauled into positions that seemed impossible to reach. Ammunition was stacked under leaves. Signals lines were run and tested. It all felt too large for the old war. He realized then that RC4 wasn't only a road, it was a throat, and someone was placing hands around it. As the French column began to move, boots, packs, radios, the disciplined shuffle of tired professionals, Morel kept his eyes on the high ground. He could not shake the feeling that the jungle had become an audience holding its breath. Min, crouched behind a screen of brush, felt his own breath turn shallow. He wasn't afraid of being shot, not exactly. He was afraid of what this would mean if it worked, because if they destroyed the column, the border would open. Aid would pour in. The war would swell. And swelling wars do not stop at roads. They spread into homes. That was the question, hanging like mist in the gorge ahead. If victory is about to arrive, what will it demand next? The road bent forward into a narrow passage where cliffs rose on both sides like a verdict. And the jungle went quiet in the specific way it does right before history speaks. The ambush did not begin with shouting. It began with absence. A convoy moves with noise even when it tries to be quiet, boots scuffing gravel, metal knocking metal, a radio operator clearing his throat. On RC4 that morning, those sounds thinned until the road seemed to swallow them. Even the birds stopped negotiating with the sky. Morel felt it first as a pressure behind the eyes. He tightened his grip on the sling of his rifle and looked up at the ridgeline that had been watching them for hours. The cliffs were too still. The jungle was too patient. Then a single crack, sharp, definite, followed by the deeper punch of weapons he'd only recently learned to fear. The front of the column halted, not because an officer ordered it, but because the road suddenly stopped being a road. It became a funnel. Orders came anyway, frantic, clipped, trying to impose geometry on a trap. Men dropped packs. Someone tried to swing a machine gun into position and discovered there was no position that wasn't already pre-aimed by the hillside. Min was not on the road. He was above it, crouched behind wet leaves, so close he could smell the sweat rising from French uniforms. His job was not to shoot. His job was to pass ammunition forward, to keep the hands on the triggers from going empty. He had been told, in the simplest words possible, "Don't break the flow." He watched the first minutes like a man watching a dam crack, not with joy, with a kind of cold disbelief. This was what recognition letters and foreign fears had purchased. A moment where an army could be forced to bleed in the shape of a map. The French tried to do what they always did, push through, regroup, call in support. But RC4 offered no room to regain balance. The ridge dictated the tempo. Every attempt to move became an invitation. Every pause became a target. Somewhere in the chaos, Morel saw a familiar face, one of the best men in his platoon, standing in the open for half a second too long, trying to drag a radio set into cover. Morel opened his mouth to shout. The shout never arrived. It died in his throat like a confession he didn't want to make. And then, as quickly as it began, the fight turned into something else, not a battle, but a collapse. The column fragmented, units lost their edges, the road filled with stranded plans. Min's shoulders burned as he ran loads forward through a shallow cut in the hillside. He tripped once, caught himself on a tree root, and felt the strap slice skin. He didn't stop to tie it. Stopping was a luxury that belonged to peacetime. Later, people would count what happened in numbers. 6,000 involved, hundreds who made it back, whole elite units shattered. Those numbers would be used as proof of French overreach, proof of Viet Minh evolution, proof that the war had become something bigger than France could afford. But in the gorge, the proof was smaller. It was the way a man's hands shook when he tried to reload, the way a messenger's eyes stayed wide even when his body moved, the way Min's mouth tasted like copper, not from blood, but from fear he was swallowing so hard it became physical. By evening, the road was no longer contested. It was decided, and the decision rippled outward fast. French posts north of the Delta withdrew. Territory that had been held as scattered islands began to connect into a coastline of control for the DRV. Most important of all, the border became real. Not just a line on a map, but a corridor. When Min walked back days later, he passed a stack of captured documents laid out under a lantern. Orders, lists, stamps, seals, French paper, Vietnamese hands. A cadre pressed a new seal onto a report with a practiced motion. Red ink blooming like a wound you could not bandage. Min stared at it and understood the final trick. Internationalization had not only brought weapons, it had locked everyone into a story that demanded escalation. Because once the border opened, aid could move, advisors could plan, training could intensify, the war could inhale deeper than before. The victory on RC-4 did not end the conflict. It widened it, sharpened it, made it legible to distant capitals that now felt responsible for the outcome. Morel, if he survived, would be moved somewhere else, to another line, another defensive position, another plan that assumed the war could be controlled by reshuffling pieces. Men would be told there were more loads to carry, more units to feed, more campaigns to prepare. And in villages like the one where the thin paper had first arrived, mothers would learn to read seals the way they once read weather: a stamp in Paris, a signature in Washington, a recognition letter from Beijing or Moscow. All of it could change the name of the war, but none of it could carry a single crate across a mountain. That work would still belong to shoulders, burning, silent, replaceable. In 1949, the war put on a new mask for the world. In 1950, on a narrow road near the Chinese border, it showed its new face to the people who had to live inside it.